Amity Shlaes is one of America's premier historians. She's the author of 6 books, among them 4 New York Times Bestsellers: Great Society, A New History, 2019; The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, 2007; Coolidge, 2013; The Forgotten Man Graphic, 2013; and The Greedy Hand, Why Taxes Drive Americans Crazy, 1999, and Germany, The Empire Within, 1991. National Review called her Forgotten Man simply the finest history of the Great Depression ever written. Ms. Shlaes is a winner of the Bradley Frederick Bastiat Hayek Book Prize. She recently won the William F. Buckley Award for Political Thought. Ms. Shlaes writes a book column for National Review as well. She has been published in a wide range of periodicals, from the New Yorker to the Washington Post and the New York Times. In the past, she wrote weekly columns for more than a decade, first for the Financial Times and then for Bloomberg. Before that, she served on the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, where for many years she focused on economics. If you read unsigned articles on tax, school choice, German unification, and regulation, many of those editorials are Amity's, actually. She wrote Coolidge was a man, a rare kind of president, a minimalist president, in her biography of the 30th president. And by the way, this year marks the 100th anniversary of the election of Calvin Coolidge to the presidency. And those of you who are political junkies, and as David French called nerds this morning, in need of numbers, you should know that while there were 3 parties in that election, the Progressives, the Democrats, and the Republicans, Coolidge did not win by a plurality. He took an absolute majority, beating the other 2 parties combined. Perhaps Amity has been honored so often because of the rigor of her work. She doesn't just make a claim, she also backs it up. She's an advisor to C-SPAN Presidential Poll and chairs the board of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, which gives the prestigious Coolidge Scholarship and leads a youth debate program based on the values of Calvin Coolidge. If you are concerned about today's colleges, then you are interested in supporting an alternate way to educate thousands of young people. The Coolidge Foundation may be a good choice for you. Amity recently co-edited the Matthew Denhart, a new edition of Coolidge's, with Matthew Denhart, a new edition of Coolidge's autobiography. Her spouse of 3 decades, veteran journalist Seth Lipsky, is editor of the New York Sun. Amity's talk today is made possible through the generous support of the Coach Foundation, whose generosity should be echoed by many of you in the audience, either individually or collectively. Title of her talk is Student Unions, Student Protests, and Building a Great Society, the 60s and Today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Amity Shlaes. Thank you. There you are.
Oh.
This is mine.
Oh, got it.
It's already read.
What a perfect introduction. Am I lucky? Yes. Very lucky. This is an unusual talk, so thank you for bearing with me. The first thing I'm going to say, I'm going to tell you a story. Some of you remember the first executive airplane. It was the Learjet, produced by William Powell Lear, a self-educated innovator. This small craft was introduced in 1963 on the then novel premise that VIPs want to fly in their own private plane. But one thing about those early Learjets, they could be dangerous. There was an engineering flaw that forced the plane from time to time into an uncheckable dive. And at dusk one evening in May 1970, a Learjet 23 bearing a VIP, his wife, and a noted architect took off from Detroit. The dark closed in, and a storm, limited visibility. At around 9:30 p.m., the little plane sought to land at a small airport to the north near a construction site at a lake called Black Lake. And instead, the jet clipped some trees and exploded. The name of the VIP who went down in the early Learjet because the pilot couldn't see the trees was Walter Reuther. Reuther. It's kind of a tough name to sound out, but R-E-U-T-H-E-R. But if you're of a certain age, and most of us are, you remember that in the 60s, can you hear me? In the 60s, that name, Reuther, could be heard most nights on the news. So right after the report on President Johnson and the war on poverty, and right before the report on Martin Luther King, or the report on Vietnam and Defense Secretary McNamara, the host would announce, Walter Reuther said, blah, 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 blah. All those names, Johnson, Reuther, McNamara, Martin Luther King, are in a small file in our brains that we label Great Society. After the domestic reform led by Johnson from 1964. And in that same small file back in our brain, there are some other facts we remember. We remember that a powerful and exciting student movement came out of nowhere and spoke truth to power. Young people teaching their elders, the baby boomers, and showing those elders through their very independence that the establishment could be changed. We remember the Great Society, and think about last night, was led by high-quality people. Johnson, the master of the Senate, Sergeant Shriver, who was the poverty czar, mighty policymakers who wrought mighty reforms, and Reuther, we remember that name too, because he happened to lead a powerful union, the United Auto Workers. We also remember, because this is President's Week, I'll say that the marvelous energy of President Kennedy and President Johnson. If you think of the Nixon-Kennedy debate and the quality of that debate on both sides. Remember, it was said that radio listeners thought Nixon won and television viewers thought Kennedy won, but both men performed beautifully and their grammar was outstanding. We remember the quality of Martin Luther King, a veritable poet of reform. And so I think because we like the people and they are likable, we rate the Great Society favorably. And God saw that it was good. But somehow there's a disconnect beyond the little file, because however good the men were in our memory, what followed the Great Society was not good. In the late 60s, the student movement more than lost its way. It went rogue, it tore up campuses, and occasionally blew up buildings. What had been an idealistic, shining protest became the Weathermen, SDS. In the 70s, cities that the Union served, that Johnson loved, Detroit, Flint, began to fail and became the kind of brutal places, war zones almost, that are the opposite of Chautauqua, where no one can walk down the street, where no one greets you, just a zone of bad roads and sad people. The kind of cities that Michael Moore makes movies about. In the 70s, the economy itself moved into a decline so bad we choose not to remember it. Do you remember the inflation of the 70s? Though civil rights law was passed in the 60s, civil rights goals were not reached. But we don't quite know why, which itself is why I went back to write the Great Society book. Of course, I started by looking at the facts, and some things we remember are true. The men were, mostly men, by and large, indeed good people. But much else I found was different from what we remember. The past is not always what it seems. I also picked up some clues in this research as to why it all ended so badly. Last night you heard the debate host say at the very beginning, the economy is the number one issue for voters in the country. Therefore, then that too was the case. And the trouble with the Great Society was the economy it wrought. And that's perhaps why the Great Society story matters. What also matters in this presidential week is the value of the good men of the 60s. But perhaps the best way to tell the story of how it all came about is through one man, and here I'll disappoint you and not say Lyndon Johnson. You'll hear enough about him in other sessions, but Walter Reuther himself, one of the best men, and I say that uncynically, the dreamer filled with light who went down in the dark. That story does take a minute to tell, which is why I'm grateful to Paul Anthony for the stunning intro, to Don and Christina Coach and their foundation for support, and to the entire ABC program for having me here today. America is a country now of closed minds, but I can see very well that one place where minds are still open is Chautauqua. Reuther's story starts with where he came from. The family were German immigrants from Rhineland-Pfalz, German reformers, socialists, if you like, social democrats, certainly. Father Valentin Reuther drove a cart. This was in the day when a cart was a truck, before the automobile, before the engine. At night, Valentin preached to his sons his vision of America, a place made up of classes, a place where one of those classes, the workers, needed more power, a place where men had to fight to get social justice, a place where not just workers in new industries, but all workers in all industries would and should challenge employers and wrest concessions from them. This vision was essentially combative. You had to take sides, as in the old Union song, which side are you on? There was no middle ground. The next chapter in the Reuther story is the Detroit to which young Reuther, Walter, came to as a young man in the 20s, and what that Detroit was. Indeed, a city of the future. Today we talk about how AI might transform the economy. Autos in the motor industry really did transform the economy. From a non-existent industry around the turn of the century, the automobile sector had grown in 2 decades to a giant industry whose every move reverberated through the economy. If Detroit was selling cars, steel did well, because steel sold to Detroit. If Detroit was selling cars, chemicals did well, because chemicals went into the car and its paint. To be able to say you worked in Detroit for an automaker in those days was like being able to say you work at Apple or Amazon or A24 today, if you know the film company. You worked for the best, the future. The pay was tops. You remember Henry Ford always insisted on high wages so that workers could buy back the car. The Detroit opportunity shone so that Walter Reuther's brothers also came to Detroit. Roy Reuther, Victor Reuther, this trio, a clan of brothers. There was a dark side, of course, to life in Detroit. The work at factories like Briggs or Ford was rough. The assembly line was a tyrant, as bad as any medieval lord. Workers worked 13 hours. The companies drove them. There were no benefits. So in reality, the price of being part of the future meant, for the moment, life was like basic training in the military or even something worse. The essential question was, what would improve conditions for the companies or for the workers? One answer might be that life would improve by itself. That often happens, just the way planes are better than they were at the time of the first Learjets. If companies mistreated their workers, well, workers would go work for another company. The companies would learn and improve, including improve conditions on their shop floors. As for the workers, one answer could be they would gain skills and graduate to higher positions. In this vision, the best opportunity for workers came through night school, not strikes. That was, they said, what made America different from Europe, the improvements and the opportunity. But another answer was that government had to do something for workers, give them power, level the field between them and these terrifying new giants, Ford, GM, Chrysler. That was the young Reuther brothers' answer. And in 1935, the government did something. President Franklin Roosevelt backed and Congress passed the Wagner Act. That's an old name, but it's important. The act gave unions power to organize. It also mandated that employers bargain with unions. The law established a separate court, the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board courts, which favored the class war vision. The law changed our culture. It changed American culture. All America citizens discovered after the Wagner Act's passage had to be union land. And all Americans had to make a choice. Which side are you on? This was Reuther's moment, for he shared his father's vision, combat first. He suggested that workers were slaves and that the factory floor was just a glorious gold-plated sweatshop. America was such a mighty country, such a rich country, and it could afford new benefits, shorter hours. The young activist wanted better conditions, but that was just his beginning. Once he had conquered Detroit, he would conquer all of America and make it a social democracy. Started, though, in the auto industry, say the 40s, the 50s, in a dramatic series of strikes that often make the pages of our school textbooks. Reuther secured leadership of the then new union, the United Auto Workers. It was a tough set of battles, not just between automakers and union men, but also within the union. Ford security men bloodied Reuther's face. You've seen the pictures. And fellow workers at River Rouge in what became known as the Battle of the Overpass. There were even assassination attempts against the Reuthers in which two of them nearly lost their lives. But the Reuthers prevailed. The UAW prevailed, and soon unions were everywhere. They gained followers, the Reuthers, by telling workers there was no other way to advance. Just because a worker punches the time clock at 10 minutes to 7, that worker to the company somehow becomes the property of General Motors. That was wrong. The companies Reuther depicted as ruthless forces that could only be tamed by militant unions. Just because they employ a worker, they don't own him. Reuther's opponents sometimes charged he was a communist or that the Reuthers worked for Moscow. You notice when you look back that Walter Reuther, as far as I can tell, never spoke at Chautauqua. Too radical. But this was false. They did not work for Moscow. They just believed in socialism or social democracy. And in fact, there was something terribly off about what they did. So you imagine the tyranny of the assembly line. It is a tyrant, as in the film Modern Times. But the unionization added a second tyranny to match the assembly line. Union rules are rigid, and if you've ever worked at a union company, you know when something broke, say, on the assembly line, well, you couldn't just fix it. You had to call the union man from the other department to fix it, right? And that was a wait that slowed production, and everyone was tense. This was not in an environment in which either workers or managers or engineers could innovate. That the workplace could be flexible enough to allow innovation was made clear in a place far away no one thought about, actually, the little factories starting up in Japan. Japanese automakers and also workers had something our unions and our companies denied us. They had a cooperative shop floor. And when a simple Japanese worker, unionized or not, spotted a problem on the assembly line, that worker could halt production, consult with the others, and fix the problem without much fuss. The team liked each other and they talked about the problem. In this way, Japanese automakers innovated faster. Of course, we didn't notice that at first. We weren't aware of the Japanese challenge in the 50s or German challenge. But some Americans knew maybe the unions were too strong. They also observed the flow of the money. Every union member, and now there were close to 1 million in the UAW, paid dues, whether he felt like it or not. Walter Reuther himself was not personally corrupt. He operated cleanly. He didn't pocket dues. But the UAW was changing, morphing from a revolutionary movement to a cash-rich bank. In 1947, and this is forgotten but so important, the nationwide discontent over unions everywhere was expressed when Congress passed a new law, the Taft-Hartley Act, And that law gave states the option of opting out of heavy unionization, of what we call the closed shop. That was called, or is sometimes called, right to work, whether you're in a union or not. That meant you could reject a union. A firm could reject a union, and a worker could reject a union and move to a state. And that, as much of a footnote as it was at the time, laid the basis for an important natural experiment. How did the union states do? How did the right to work states do? Who employed more? Who got richer? But back then, again, that seemed not important. The reality was the jobs in the 40s and 50s were in the auto and machine tool regions, likewise unionized. GM and Chrysler and Ford, after resisting, went along. They supported government subsidies to build highways straight through every city so that people would have a place to drive their cars. The automakers liked that and accepted the wage and benefit demands from the workers. They were making such good profits, the demands didn't really matter. Mayors also went along taking federal money for roads and public housing, bulldozing whole neighborhoods where new arrivals, especially African Americans, had lived, building tall housing projects in places like Detroit or St. Louis. If you think of what Chautauqua is, and I mean it, that America, one where you can walk down the street and see someone, where there aren't so many cars, a little town for pedestrians, a strong community, that is the America that was eradicated by the highway building project and by urban renewal. Yet the builders were confident. If the economy continued to grow, well, then people would fill up the new housing projects, and heck, you had to live with it. It was growth. By the 50s, it was standard. Reuther and his UAW were extracting victory after victory from the companies. He loved these campaigns. And he also, so you can get his character, he dreamt of a retreat he would build for workers deep in the wood at Black Lake, Michigan, a compound in modern architecture style, not Frank Lloyd Wright, but more Scandinavian. He admired Scandinavia, like the rest houses the Social Democrats built there. Here, his workers could rest, they could contemplate, just as in Europe. He liked the lake, which featured all kinds of fish. That was his lake, even sturgeon. And you can imagine his excitement. What a vision. American factory workers fish and dine like kings in their own castle on their own caviar. To many, too, it seemed the 50s were the right path. Workers got their own homes. There's a joke about the 1950s. They say Democrats like the 50s. They want to go back to the 50s because they want to work there. Republicans want to go back to the 50s because they want to live there. Like a square situation. And it seemed, indeed, that we could afford any expansion. Reuther went disciplined to all his meetings with the company. He was not a man who drank. He brought his toothbrush to the long sessions of negotiation with Ford or GM as a symbol of his absolute determination to sit out until he won gains for his people. And companies feared him. After all, he had the power to idle them and destroy their profits with lengthy strikes. He became that man on the nightly news I described. So by the early 60s, flush with success, Reuther was ready to turn to the larger goal, taking social democracy national, getting all American workers the benefits automakers now had, getting health care for senior citizens, getting civil rights for all. Unions should be part of the social justice movement, he believed, and even take the lead. And of course, expanding unions, including in new populations, such as winning more black members and integrating them in factories or building a student wing among college students. His brothers worked alongside with him, building out the vision. Also on Reuther's list, but not at the top, was getting rid of that right to work provision, that little tiny thing that actually gave companies and workers an out. So he wanted to close it, to end right to work, to repeal it so that nobody would fly off, sort of like Elon Musk, to another world. All America would be stuck in union land. To succeed in all these ambitions, the Reuthers needed allies. they needed a federal partner. And kind of the serendipity of it, they found one instantly in the Kennedy brothers. The Ruther brothers were a clan. They worked together, a team. The Kennedys were a clan that worked as a team. John Kennedy so believed in clan that he made the unusual decision to appoint his little brother attorney general, right? So Robert, and so the Kennedys and the Ruthers kind of recognized each other. They saw their families mirrored, and they liked each other. It was a kind of love affair, Kennedy-Ruther. In 1960, Ruther and his brothers led the UAW, and along with that, plenty of the CIO, in working for and also funding the Kennedy presidential campaign. The data suggests it was the Ruthers and the millions of votes of union workers that won Kennedy that close election. The union's key role was so obvious that Kennedy joked about it in a speech to union men soon after the election. That's what's nice about Kennedy. He could make a joke about his realities. He said this was a speech to unions, after speaking to the Chamber of Commerce and the AMA, the American Medical Association, I began to wonder how I got elected. Here now, in the Union Hall, now I remember. You did it. He gave them credit. The new president endorsed the Ruthers' ambitious vision as well. They didn't just he praised them for seeking more than wage increases for members and for a larger vision that can strengthen the U.S. and the free world. The first area where the Kennedys, and again, some of this was new to me and maybe to you, worked together was civil rights. Ruther supported Martin Luther King. He marched in the South side by side with MLK. In the background, the Kennedys were ambivalent, as you know. The Kennedys supported the civil rights effort. Ruther became the front man for them. It was easier for a union leader to march than the White House. How much so? When MLK landed in the Birmingham jail, bail was set over $100,000. The Kennedy administration didn't know what to do, so RFK, the Attorney General, called Walter Reuther. Reuther found the cash, strapped it onto two union leaders under their coats, and sent them down to bail out MLK and his allies. Why me? Reuther asked RFK. RFK answered, this is the original RFK, you were the only one we knew to call. That kind of money, that kind of energy. Another area where Reuther moved with the Kennedys' blessing, expansion of unions into new sectors. RFK personally went to California to work with Cesar Chavez and his United Farm Workers, a Reuther project. They aimed to unionize agriculture. And another matter, as you know, perhaps, there was a famous meeting of students and activists in 1962 at Port Huron, Michigan. It's mentioned in the movie Big Chill, but some of you old enough to remember it. You've heard about the meeting. Starting with students from the University of Michigan, including one named Sharon Jeffrey, an activist, spent a few days in some rustic cabins there, Chautauqua. They walked on the beach and they produced a historic document, the Port Huron Statement, a manifesto of youth speaking to power. I'll read you one line from it because it's not very threatening and it's awful idealistic. We are people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, looking uncomfortably to the world we inherit. Figures who were present at Port Huron later became famous. You've heard of Michael Harrington, who wrote The Other America, he was the J.D. Vance of the day, wrote the book about poverty. Tom Hayden, the one who was married to Jane Fonda. The Port Huron crowd called for what they called participatory democracy, and that theirs seemed in a kind of independent cri de coeur. What I didn't realize till I researched this book, that Port Huron was not an independent event. Sharon Jeffrey, one of those students, was the daughter of Reuther's key aide, Mildred Jeffrey. She's very nice. I looked at her a lot. Mildred arranged the cabins. The union sponsored the event. Mildred even drove over like a mom to check out what was happening in the Port Huron deliberations and then reported back to the Reuther team. Out of Port Huron, Students for a Democratic Society emerged. And when the workers came out with their manifesto and went to work as activists in cities or as essayists, Reuther's shop gave them grants. Money was involved. Hayden, for example, received a $5,000 grant to start something called the Economic Research and Action Project. And Hayden himself described this before he died. Whenever we were in trouble or needed money, Tom Hayden said, the call would go out to Sharon's mother, to the UAW. This is not to say there wasn't much to admire in student efforts, but a union-steered revolution is essentially different from a spontaneous revolt. And that discovery, I think, should motivate us to look very carefully to who is supporting what in the protests today. When President Kennedy died so tragically in 1963, Reuther could have lost his partner. But within days of the assassination, and you can hear this on YouTube because the Johnson tapes are there, he knew he had not. The new President Johnson called Reuther and said, Walter, I need you. And in some ways, Johnson was actually a better partner than Kennedy, for Johnson liked the big plans for social democracy better. He was willing to share and advance Walter's vision much more energetically. And of course, Johnson was the master of the Senate. You know, perhaps you know the comment they said, Johnson passed laws the way other men eat chocolate chip cookies. He could get anything through. You've heard of the famous speech he delivered in 1964, the one where he announced the Great Society endeavor to improve life in the cities, the countryside, and the classroom, the 3 C's. Not everyone, however, remembers where that speech took place. Of course, it was Michigan, Reuther's territory. When Johnson arrives, Ann Arbor, right? Reuther is there, a kind of co-host. The pair became enthusiastic partners in all areas of Great Society, this drive, even improving cities. The Model Cities program, the Great Society, was drafted by Reuther at his kitchen table. Medicare and Medicaid became law. Johnson expanded other programs. All these things kept both men busy. 1966, 67, 68 passed, and Johnson did not do one thing. He did not push through the repeal of right to work. He just couldn't get the votes. He badgered Everett Dirksen of Illinois to support it, but Dirksen wouldn't. And so sort of by legislative accident, right to work remained. By 68, of course, as you know very well, Johnson was struggling. The Vietnam War was now #1 on the news. The Walter Reuther business was becoming second. And the Great Society project was derailing. The trouble wasn't Vietnam alone. Voters didn't like many of the Great Society measures or did not find them satisfying. Reuther was struggling as well as, think of the chronology. The civil rights laws were passed in 64 and 65, but there were riots afterwards. Watts and then in Reuther's own Detroit. To Reuther's shock, even African-American workers in the UAW were not friendly to him. The hostility to Reuther in the UAW among Black Americans is stunning. It's as stunning as things young people say today when we don't expect it. The Black workers didn't say praise Reuther or we would like to discuss with Reuther reform in the UAW. They said behead the redhead. And they said it a lot and made signs. Reuther, the rebel, found himself pictured all of a sudden, and that's disconcerting always, as the establishment, the enemy. He said, why don't they understand me? I'm just trying to make the system work. The former students he had funded were not grateful either. Johnson supported the war in Vietnam, so Reuther had to, for all the students and the activists did not understand that. His own daughters didn't understand it. Their group, the SDS, did go radical. Some became anarchists. And at a most important event for the Democratic Party and Reuther, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 68, Reuther might have expected his student wing to support the candidate he chose. Not at all. Instead, Reuther's old proteges were out there on Michigan Avenue, in Lincoln Park, in Grant Park, protesting so violently, battling with police, that the Democratic Party divided. Thus did Reuther's own children contribute to the victory of the man Reuther so opposed, who seemed opposite of a union candidate, Richard Nixon. Another factor Reuther missed in all this confusion was those Japanese autos. Thanks to the plants there, the determination of the Japanese automakers and their people, they were beginning to produce those innovative, competitive cars. And the cars were of a quality and price Americans liked. In the very days Reuther was agonizing, Reuther agonistes at the Chicago convention, some of the early Corollas were rolling onto the dock in California. Reuther was really disappointed. As his daughter recalled, he began to doubt himself, a confident man. In the car, he turned to his wife and said, "Do you think they are still listening to me?" ? He would talk with Johnson. "I'm no goddamn fascist," Johnson told Reuther on the phone. Walter told Johnson that he understood Johnson was laboring under, quote unquote, an impossible task. The pair were going down together. It's no wonder, therefore, that in his last years, 69, 70 Nixon years, Reuther increasingly encountered troubles. The Federal Reserve accommodated Johnson's and then Nixon's spending. Inflation was beginning to eat at the paychecks Reuther had so carefully crafted. It was also, therefore, no wonder, I think, what do you do when you're beleaguered? You tinker. That Reuther turned to the project at Black Lake. Black Lake was his consolation, his model train set, his dollhouse, his hobby all in one. He lovingly worked with the architect, whose name was Arthur Stonerov, and he looked at each stone or wall at Black Lake. His brother recalled that he would put on a Tyrolean hat when he walked around Black Lake, also European style, and inspect every cranny. He fussed over the covered walkways that would make it possible for the workers to walk from one building to another when it rained. It was this daydream, this distraction of Reuther's that drove him to board the Learjet that night in May, to ignore the weather. And, after he died fairly quickly, he was forgotten, though Michigan did name a highway after him, Interstate 696. You may know that spur. He didn't see all the consequences of the policies he had promoted. 70s, 80s, 90s, competition from those foreign cars shut out Detroit. It turned out our costly cars were too expensive. Maybe our wages were too expensive. The industry became unaffordable. Detroit suffered, Flint suffered, other cities struggled as well. The country taught itself a new word, stagflation, the combo of inflation and unemployment. The Midwest region that Reuther loved, that had been America's hope, now also got a new name, the Rust Belt. The 70s, in a way, if you want to compare them to the 50s, they were the opposite. Everyone wanted to live or work in the 50s. Nobody wanted to live, work, or start a business in the 70s. Unemployment kept pounding us. The housing projects that Reuther and the unions had supported proved hell for tenants. In the end, as I describe in the book, the cities and housing authorities simply knocked the buildings down and blew the rest up. An irony, the one area where there was hope was that area where Reuther had failed to get what he wanted, right to work. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, jobs were proliferating in right-to-work states. The natural experiment was showing results that demonstrated less unionized can be better. The example of those states proved so strong that Americans generally took notice. They began to question the utility of unions. In Reuther's heyday, more than 20% of workers in the private sector were unionized. Now that rate is about 6%. Industrial America turned away from unions, and a great humiliation, about 15 years ago, even Michigan voted to become a right-to-work state. Why did it all happen this way? The first factor was illusions. We had nursed kind of pre-Great Society, but I think they're related. In the 50s, we had no competition right after World War II, and we thought it would always stay that way. We assumed there was always only us. The 50s urban renewal projects wronged cities, and we live with the consequences of that right through today. A larger error was the assumption that social democracy of the Great Society would be affordable. That too proved simply wrong. Instead of a participatory democracy revolution with massive social programs, we should perhaps have had a property rights revolution. What if all those families owned houses? That would have probably had a better outcome. The quality of the leadership mattered. It mattered so much, and I know we all thought about that last night again, but it mattered less than the quality of the policy, and that was poor. Also an important error, the assumption that more action from above is always better. Johnson graded himself on his inputs, if you think of how you manage your own metrics, all those Great Society laws. But he didn't care about the outputs, the results. Sometimes less is more. A lot of this damage, of course, as I say, emerged subsequent to Reuther's death that night, the Learjet. In a way, that was a blessing for him. But the crash that night in 70 can be for us a symbol of the great crash and burn of the great, great society. A symbol that tells us that a plan executed with the best of intentions can still fail, even a plan executed by the best of men. Thank you very much. Want to get down? No. I need a question about Calvin Coolidge.
Hello? Anybody have a question? Come up here.
Particularly about Calvin Coolidge.
If you can come around this way if you have a question, because you're coming in front of the cameras and you get your back side on the camera as well as your front side on the camera. Okay, you ready?
Can you speak to today's resurgence of the labor movement and what you think the forces are that are behind that?
I don't know if there are any sinister forces except the sinister force of ignorance. I'm not anti-union, but I see, you see the damage that unions did. I think the little adage I have at the front of the book is nothing is new, it is just forgotten. It feels good. Think of the policy of the heart versus the policy of the brain. The politics, it feels good to say you're doing something for workers. Workers do need help, but if you're doing the wrong thing, you may not help them. I think it's also a generational matter, as it was in the 60s. Young people want to do something their predecessors didn't do. Even within the Republican Party, nobody wants to be a Reaganite. Oh no, right? And that's just the premium on novelty.
Okay, very good, Jack.
I'll hold it, Jack. Okay.
Where's
Amity, I had a book out last year called Untenable, The True Story of White Ethnic Flight from America's Cities. I had the fortune or misfortune of growing up in Newark, New Jersey in the 60s, and I watched the Great Society cause some major dislocations, including my house. But the neighborhood I grew up in was virtually 90% Democratic, 90% pro-Kennedy. When I reached out to the people I grew up with, 90% of them now vote Republican. Do you address that in your book? And if so, tell us what you think about that.
Well, of course I do. I mean, Kennedy was rather conservative if you actually compare him to Johnson. He made a few errors a moderate shouldn't make. In my view, one was signing Executive Order 10988, which was the enabling signal for public sector unions. But he was kind of not so, he was supportive of Reuther in a general way, but not passing the programs Reuther wrote. Newark is important because it's in the book. I'm glad you wrote that book. My mother, too, is from Newark. Tom Hayden went to work in Newark, doing work on housing, trying to help people. And what was he trying to help them do? Be more militant tenants. Great. Who wants to be a landlord if you have militant tenants? You know the Airbnb debates. That was really productive because it curtailed the availability of affordable housing. But it felt nice, the Union cartoon, right? The outrage cartoon. So what else can I say? Some people learned the lesson and they took a more moderate view, and that might have meant becoming a Kennedy-style Democrat or a Republican. But I look forward to your book.
Yeah, I have a question I don't understand about Calvin Coolidge.
Thank goodness.
Could you elaborate on what was behind the 1924 Immigration Act that was passed under Calvin Coolidge?
Well, yeah, we get asked, I'm the chairman of the Coolidge Foundation, we get told Coolidge was racist every day because of this law, which restricted immigration. Contra the Ken Burns documentary, however, it's too big a stretch to blame Coolidge for the Holocaust. Just saying. Coolidge believed the percentage of foreign-born, Coolidge was no bigot. The percentage of foreign-born Americans in the country was rather high, well over 20%. You know, it wasn't so high, say, in Johnson's years, right? Thanks to Coolidge's law. Coolidge believed several things. One was that if you came to America, you might try to adapt to the American way, by which, for example, and this would be controversial today, in public institutions, you speak English. That doesn't mean you can't teach your little children your language at home or send them to parochial school and where they're bilingual all day long. But that it was divisive, and he was kind of an English firster. He also believed that people needed to learn about how America works, new arrivals, so they could fit in and also help us. He had a great appreciation for immigrants and went out of his way to say that many, many times. He said, you might have come over here on the Mayflower a few centuries ago or come over 3 years ago in steerage, but we are all in the same boat here now. So to say Coolidge was a racist, I think, is just a bad smear. The law itself was just almost universally supported in Congress. Even if he had vetoed it, he would have been overridden. And the consensus was that America needed a pause in immigration. That's not the same as being a xenophobe. That's not the same as hating foreigners, that we needed a pause to absorb the tremendous migration that came from the 1890s up to this point. So when someone says that, you just have to say, bigotry and restricting immigration are not the same. And kind of stand your ground on that, because it happens to be true. It has that added virtue.
My father was in the Sanitation Workers Union in New York City, so I found this very interesting, this history. You had mentioned that the black workers were upset with Reuther in the 1960s, and I wondered if you could elaborate more about the working conditions for the black workers. Were they able to, move forward? Were they working, integrated or separate?
Yeah, that's very important. Reuther wasn't bigoted. Plenty of his union was, right? And also the black workers were often the least skilled, and they were new. And let's face it, people are clannish in the Midwest, so these newcomers come, right? And the black workers struggled with that. There was a large infusion of black workers. I recommend the movie Which Side Are You On?, which is a very pro-union movie about the Reuthers. And you'll see the black workers talking there and complaining. They had a problem. That doesn't mean the problem wouldn't go away, again, if they had time to gain some skills, if they hadn't been driven out of their houses in Detroit. The neighborhood called Paradise Valley was destroyed. If they'd had more support, if welfare hadn't been the chief way we worked with African Americans, which is what it was. So the question is, why were they so angry? I think it's the same anger you hear today that's so shocking. Rebellion was in the air, and also a factor I downplayed intentionally, but it was real here, Vietnam. Who was dying in Vietnam? Well, lieutenants, right? But also enlisted men, GIs, many of whom were black. Once you lost your brother in Vietnam, you had a different view of the world. So that was an enormous factor for African Americans as well. The deaths of African Americans in Vietnam, and a legitimate one.
We're allowing a rare follow-up question.
Thank you very much. I guess I wonder, is not the leader of the union responsible for how his union conducts themselves in regard to racial.
Oh, totally. Totally. And I would say he did his best. I mean, I don't think marching with MLK could be any more of a single signal than one could give. But it's like any massive institution, the Federal Reserve, the Agriculture Department, Ford. What the boss wants at the top, he has to push through ensconced constituencies, middle management, and that proved hard. And maybe Walter didn't try hard enough because he was so busy with his beautiful symbolism.
Hi. As you know, unionization went in a very different direction in Europe. What are your thoughts about Rentish capitalism, where unions are actually sitting on the boards of companies and they seem to be working slightly better as partners?
Ruther actually kind of pushed for that. If you go back on, I think it's Mike Wallace, you can see that video. He wanted to be on the board. He had a great respect for what the Germans call Mitbestimmung, co-determination. I'm not wild about it because it tends to make products expensive. One reason Germany has done all right with that is the incredible discipline of the German people. I haven't studied it lately, but what I'm recalling is when the world became too expensive for German automakers, they sat down with their unions in their boards and said, we're going to have to cut back. And the unions agreed to tough cuts. Maybe cuts that American unions might not have agreed to, certainly not in their current mood, which is belligerent.
One of the things I think we sort of walk away here is that good people, good-minded people who have good intentions could easily have bad policies that have bad outcomes. Can you talk, please, about our 30th president a little bit, and how come it seemed he balanced the budget 6 out of 6 years, and he would go to his cabinet officers and say, gee, you could do what you do and spend 10% less. He kept Mellon as a Secretary of the Treasurer. And what about this gentleman we sort of miss as sort of
Coolidge.
in the anchor of presidents and President's Week?
But yeah, I spend my whole life devoted to Coolidge for that reason. Coolidge was a great leader and an unusual leader. I think Paul Anthony mentioned he led, he was a bit like Ike in that he led through other people. He was a super duper delegator, which is wise. He didn't just come down. He watched what happened, and his representative did things too. He definitely believed in government restraint. He believed in it kind of temperamentally. He was naturally an accountant, and he believed in it because he believed that would assure American international financial primacy, which it did. That we would, if we narrowed the deficit and rent surpluses, we would become the currency of reserve, and we did because of his restraint. Coolidge also squandered nothing in politics. You know, why is scandal bad? Why is scandal bad? It's because if you have a scandal, as President Clinton did, you don't get some legislation you want through Congress because you're so busy on this scandal. It's setting aside the moral judgments about scandal. Coolidge was terrified of scandal. He made his sons wear suit and tie or even evening dress, like tux, every night at dinner in the White House. He showed the people that, unlike his predecessor, Warren Harding, who was sort of like Clinton, a smart guy but a bit sloppy, that he was devoted, determined to get his policy through. What do you name a White House pet? Usually something light for the feature story, so you name the White House pet. I don't know. Think of White House pet names. Checkers, right? I want to hear another one. But, right. Usually, right, Fala was the Roosevelt's. The Coolidge received a gift of twin lion cubs from South Africa, and the Coolidges really liked animals. Some ended up in the zoo. And he named those lion cubs Budget Bureau and Tax Reduction. And you can imagine the whole cartoon. So you can draw the cartoon yourself. There are the cubs. You feed even Steven. You send the steak across the board. And this was to his point that you could not cut taxes unless you also cut the budget, which he did. But there's another point that I make, like if I'm just giving a whole Coolidge speech, and I promise to give a Coolidge speech if you desire it. I do think he's the best. It wasn't just Coolidge's greatness, his restraint, his discipline, his knowledge of finance, his common law, gentlemanly behavior, his civility, never said a mean word about anyone, no calling anyone a liar anymore. It was also policy. What happened was, in 1920, as now, the GOP had a choice. It could kind of go with the new progressives. You notice there's some new progressive Republicans, right? They want things the Democrats want. Maybe they'll get more votes. Or it could go retro, go Reaganite. In that case, in 1920, of course, that would be laissez-faire, right? Back to the 19th century. And the popular choice was to go progressive. As you know, the Progressive Party that split off was made of Republicans, right? And that was a danger. If you don't go progressive, GOP, you'll split up and the Democrats will always win. That's what they said. Nonetheless, the GOP in 1920, after consulting with itself, said, we're going retro. We're going to cut taxes. We're going to cut the budget. We're going to be like the robber barons. They didn't say that, but that's what others said. We're going to be we don't care about class war. We don't care about income distribution. We don't care. We only care about the market and the opportunity for companies. I'm paraphrasing. I'm not reading you from the program, so forgive me and don't hold me to each word. But that was the gist of it. So the president, and what did they mean by normalcy? You heard that phrase, right? 1920, Harding, Coolidge won on normalcy. And when I was a kid, I thought that was like the world's worst slogan. Normalcy, they want us to be cogs. Don't they care about freedom? That is not what they meant. They meant a normal environment so business could have a chance to thrive. Yes, and Harding came in. He hired the world's best Treasury Secretary, a robber baron, actually, as depicted by the progressive papers, Andrew Mellon, the great magnate from Pittsburgh, and he was not embarrassed. He did not apologize for his capitalism, Harding. He put through a first tax cut. He passed a law that made them able to budget, called the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. We had a whole conference about that. That facilitated budgeting and president line item vetoes, which existed then, as well as vetoes. Then Harding messes up. He messes up in bad ways. The platform said they were going essentially to privatize resources the government had control of in World War I. The privatization of energy resources, Navy reserves, turned out to be corrupt, Harding's. That was Teapot Dome. Well, why is that terrible? It's terrible, one, because it's bad to be corrupt, but two, because the corruption of Teapot Dome, of giving leases to friends of Harding's, besmirched the very case for something the party said it was for, privatization. Well, if private parties come along, well, it's like Russia, right? It's not real free markets. It's just friends of friends. Let the government keep the money. So Harding dirtied this agenda, and then he died. Usually when the president dies, well, the agenda is over. No. Coolidge picked up that agenda off the ground, or like a baton in a relay race, and ran with it and did everything the 1920 GOP agenda said, only better than Harding, unencumbered as he was with personal errors and so on, and also, frankly, operating in a stronger economy. That was, in part, the result of Harding policy. So what I see is that when you put policy first, even with such a stellar president as the underrated Calvin Coolidge, you are robust to scandal. You have more chance to go ahead. Today, we don't even write party platforms, or if we do, we disregard them. It's all about the man, and that's a problem. Yeah.